To introduce our next speaker, Helmut Draxler, and while I'm trying to find you the title of your paper, where is it? It's, okay, you have to keep it. So I'm going to introduce Helmut to you, although I guess, but nevertheless I'll still do it. So he's an art historian and a cultural critic working on the intersections of art, politics, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. And now I'm going to read what is written here. I'm sorry, but I'm going to read it because here it states, between 1914 and 2023, he has been professor of art theory at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. 1914, imagine that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, you see, I'm not the youngest.
And I'm also, so we, yeah, it's a date. No. But so publications. Was tun, was lassen? Politik als symbolische Form is an upcoming or already? It's already there.
Comes next month.
Next month. So it's a book published with Tentare in Freising. And then we have Die Wahrheit der niederländischen Malerei, eine Archäologie der Gegenwartskunst. Published in 2021, and then Abdrift des Wollens, eine Theorie der Vermittlung, published with Turia and Kant in 2017. And we have a sense for projects, the problem of the public and contemporary art, which is also forthcoming. And now I have to get a view on the title of your paper so that I can read it. Thank you very much. So the title is L'objet petit b, Boundary as Object in Psychoanalysis, Philosophy and Politics. Please join me in welcoming Helmut Draxler.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Jan, for this nice introduction, and thank you, Jelica, for having me here. For me, this is always a great honor to come to such a place of rigorous philosophical commitment, and as we have, over years, and as we have experienced today as well. And for me, I'm not a close reader, as you can see in the list of my publications. I'm more a, syncretist and generalist in a certain way, and that is why you will get a very broad sort of introduction, because in Vienna I always have to do the introductions, that, brought me into this direction, of generalizing very much. But it's also, when this topic came in, and Jelica sent me the title, it also provoked, what can I make out of that, and how does it relate to my reality? And I felt very strongly affected by this topic in a certain way. And that's why you will get this very broad overview now from my side. But I hope that in the end we still have some, specific topics to discuss. So there are lots of relations to other topics which have been discussed so far. So the question of a possible reconfiguration of borders in philosophy, politics, and psychoanalysis this conference is based upon, on Jelica's research project, is undoubtedly one of the great challenges of our time. Nothing seems to be more emotionally contested today than borders or boundaries. They have become the very deployment of polarizing political strategies in a way that makes it almost impossible to hold a view on them that would not immediately be assigned to one of these strategies and positioned against the other. Left or right has become a confessional question of how you approach and value the border. In other words, the equation is always already answered within the respective political strategy and requires no further thought. It is almost as if Deleuze and Guattari, in their attribution of deterritorialization to revolutionary desire and re-territorialization to fascism, have set the course for a dominant pattern of thought that has prevailed on a broad front in recent decades. So it has become very popular in a certain way, I think one can. far into the liberal mainstream. Is there still something to be done here? That is the question in the context of an academic conference, or is the repetition of such an affirmation that we on the left are against borders and that overcoming all borders must be the real goal of emancipatory politics? Doubts are justified here, I think. Not only because the enumeration of politics, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and art in the title of this conference already refers to disciplinary boundaries and thus distinguishes itself from the sheer transdisciplinary emphasis of today's dominant Western discourse production in the humanities. No, not in mathematics, but in the humanities, everything. You have to be transdisciplinary to get a job in a discipline. And the university politics, we could experience that at the Angewandte in Wien very strongly. It has become a dominant discourse in a certain way, and a completely emptied out formula. It doesn't stand for anything. But those doubts are justified above all because the avoidance strategy, in general, of political thinking associated with confessionalism seems to me to be responsible for a standstill in the political areas, especially since the left, or rather the left-wing parties, we should distinguish here, have been forced into a rather defensive position over the issue of a border since 2015. Not 19, but 2000. Yeah. So this is not only because the right has made the question of the border its essential and extremely successful mobilization element, but also because the liberal or left liberal mainstream has not been able to clarify its own preconditions and limits. Neither with regard to its former proximity to the liberal globalization narrative of the 1990s, which hypocritically proclaimed an end to all borders, but only meant the borders of capital, nor with regard to today's strategies for adapting an authoritarian and belligerent defense rhetoric in support of a supposed openness, as they are positioned in the context of what is now called the multipolar world order, not globalization anymore. In both forms, open borders are increasingly proving to be purely phantasmatic. Therefore, the decisive question will be whether borders can be thought of, evaluated, and politically positioned in a different way than in the sense of such a strict polarity, not in order to avoid the political alternative between left and right, but in order to be able to justify a left perspective better on the border, that means less phantasmatically. On the one hand, this would imply to better recognize the particular historical constellation in which borders have to be disputed in such a polarized way, and on the other, to work through the deep logical aporias in the thinking and the politics of borders. With regard to the historical constellation, and I'm getting very speculative here, but I think I need this very general assumption, we could assume that what we call modernity is best be understood as a specific symbolic structure that owes itself to a continuous interplay between the blurring and the re-establishing of boundaries. Only in the context of such an interplay does the boundary take on that fundamental significance on the epistemic as well as on the social, psychological, cultural, and political levels. That means, for example, the call for a dissolution of the boundaries of knowledge, as it was put forward in the mode of critique against all authorities in the early modern period, first establishes knowledge as knowledge and not as truth. Truth would be if it would follow the authority and the model. Then we are in the realm of truth in a certain way. But in questioning that, something else is established, which is called then, in the modern sense, knowledge. And this model of a determining negation, meaning a definition of something as knowledge precisely in rejecting its traditional boundaries, has also proven to be immensely influential for the demands for the abolition of all economic and political barriers, and thus for the elimination of any perceived restrictions for the subjects. This means that these critical demands for a rejection of all boundaries are based on a particular subject position that is only defined by them. The modern subject comes into being as the one that disturbs and challenges the existing order and thus establishes the limits and identifies itself precisely by doing so. Obviously, this attitude has provoked, anti-modern counter-reactions and corresponding subject positions that not only try to defend the existing orders by any means necessary, but increasingly also adopt the modern critical position themselves, now directed in what they consider to be the dominant liberal order for subjectivities. Thus, the anti-moderns have become moderns themselves. Hence, both the blurring of boundaries and the re-establishing in the same act are part of the modern symbolic structures and thus part of a problem rather than its solution. A decision between deterritorialization and re-territorialization is not even on the table here, because both sides implicitly always already participate in the other. Rather, in their relation to one another, these concepts represent the precondition from which the particular subject and collective formations, for example, within the framework of territorial nation-states, the languages and biopolitical relations, classes and genders, become comprehensible in the first place. In other words, even if we decide in one direction, we are always playing the symbolic game at the same time. And that seems to be our very problem today. It might be even one of the reasons why even, quote, extreme politicization remains without political consequences, as the young Belgian philosopher Anton Jäger has called it, in relation to the diverse forms of activism since around 2010. So modernity can be understood as a specific historical formation that seeks to gain its identity through difference, that limits and defines itself by dissolving its traditional boundaries. So if this is the case, then this interplay of a symbolic between the blurring and re-establishing of boundaries must first and foremost be addressed itself. This is because it cannot be suspended within its parameters as either limitation or pure openness, and certainly not in the name of purely empirical or practical stakes, for example, by aiming to abolish one's own limitations, that means privileges and symbolic categories. This is precisely what drives the imaginary and implements the symbolic. Rather, this interplay itself must first be understood also as a prerequisite of our own thinking and acting, in the sense that it cannot become completely transparent to us. The boundary always indicates a limit of our own understanding. In this sense, philosophical thinking of the boundary, as it was elaborated by Kant and Hegel, is always already an expression of such an interplay, and at the same time provides the decisive components of any possible reflection on it. Whether the focus here is more on the positive enabling side of a boundary or on the negative restrictive side, more on the semantic or on the pragmatic aspects that concern the setting or removal of boundaries, it is always a matter of defining what a boundary is in the first place, whether it has an ontological or purely a logical dimension, whether it relates more to the outer boundary of a thing, that means its form, or its inner qualitative determination as identity, or whether it lies between different things and defines a line, a zone, or a region whose ontological status is in turn highly indeterminate, and finally, whether and how the boundary functions as an operator of difference, and which entities or instances it thus produces, as an operator of difference. What is produced through that, operation of differences? The boundary first determines what understanding and reason, Verstand und Vernunft, can be, or how the mind, the Geist, realizes itself, or how, for example, reality establishes itself as identity in general, as Hegel says, but how it also determines and keeps the other present, the other of reason, as well as the infinite in the finite, and vice versa. In view of a variety of facets that become visible in these different definitions, it might become clear that even this concept of boundary, or that even what this concept of boundary is employed for or needed for, cannot be put into practice without contradiction, neither in Kant nor in Hegel. For the boundary is not simply an object of thought that can be determined positively, rather it always indicates a boundary in itself, a boundary in thought itself. And this is precisely the point both in Kant's philosophy as a science of reason and in Hegel's Geistphilosophie. In order to arrive at a new positivity or totality via the boundary as the actual operator of difference. For Kant, I keep this all very close when it's getting to close reading. As it is very well known, the boundary is first and foremost the enabling instance of a knowledge that reason produces in the critical work upon itself, and thus lays the foundation for a future metaphysics on the basis of presuppositions completely insightful to itself. Yeah? So Vernunft tries to understand itself as Vernunft. Laying such a foundation by drawing a clear line, a Grenzlinie, against the speculative, uncontrolled growth to which reason is inclined, because it always wants to be more than reason in a certain way, conditions the possibility of synthetic judgments a priori. However, that foundation of true knowledge, can by no means be understood statically. So it can't be achieved in saying, here we now have, a new foundation of what Vernunft is for. Rather, the metaphysics at issue here remains constitutively a future one, because every determination in its name can itself be subjected to criticism again, as Kant's four examples clearly show. His four examples are the free will, that we can even think in a certain way, God as the final cause, the immortality of the soul, and the purposiveness of nature. And today, hardly anyone would understand them as directly plausible to their own reason, the purposiveness of nature, or God as final cause and immortality of the soul. I mean, about free will we could maybe still debate, but the others are completely gone. Thermodynamics and the theory of evolution in the 19th century have swept away the last remnants of such self-evidence of reason, or rather of faith within the boundaries of pure reason. In other words, it is precisely the transcendental drawing of boundaries that prevents any conclusion of knowledge. Yeah? So it prohibits and makes impossible the foundation the philosophy as pure science is aiming at. Any suspension of knowledge in truth, but also any satisfaction of reason, because reason strives for truth, and thus contributes to the tremendous dynamization of knowledge by understanding, durch den Verstand, which must constantly present new facts to reason for examination. The transcendental nature of reason thus becomes an incentive or drive to know more and more. That means to transgress the limits of current knowledge. Knowledge here is always simultaneously more knowledge, and the concept of a transcendental not only means the conditions of the possibility of knowledge, but always also the projection onto the future of such conditions. Yeah, it's not just right now the conditions of possibility, but the future conditions of possibility of more knowledge. Yeah? The claim of knowledge freed from all authority turns out to be a kind of perpetuum mobile in that sense, that produces more and more knowledge without truth, without integrative authority or synthesis. And AI is maybe the epitome and logical consequence of this kind of, transcendental perpetuum mobile. Hegel was obviously not satisfied with this. With him, the boundary is given an existential charge. It is conceived now as radically immanent, because every determination is negation, and therefore always carries this negation within itself and only becomes real through this, immanentization, only within, because it's, the negation is part of, what defines the identity. You can't get rid of it. So, quote, something is what it is only in its limit and through its limit. We must therefore not regard the boundary as merely external to existence Dasein, but rather as running through the whole of existence. It says in the encyclopedia, or, quote, in existence, negation is still directly identical with being, and this negation is what we call the boundary. It's this radical immanenticized boundary. In other words, this radically internalized boundary opens up an area within things where being and nothingness, the same and the other, the finite and the infinite, meet and relate to each other precisely through demarcation from each other. The boundary, this pure in-betweenness, becomes the operator of a mediation, this specifically Hegelian term of Vermittlung, that by virtue of the negation of negation transfers everything into the processuality of becoming. The infinite of such a becoming is therefore not, as in Romanticism, the goal of an endless striving. Infinity is not over there, it's right in here. It is always already present in every object, thing, or existence, Dasein, by virtue of a boundary, and thus indicates its path to an affirmative infinity. So both versions of a philosophy of a boundary, border, limit do not seem to me to live up to their self-imposed claims. Neither can the foundation of a new metaphysics acceptable to reason actually be laid out in the name of a transcendental, nor can the internalized boundary be fully operationalized in the name of mediation, Vermittlung towards an affirmative infinity. Both procedures always presuppose the respective speculative assumptions with regard to the determinations of reason or mind spirits, which are not only increasingly difficult to share, I'm having problems to share affirmative infinity, maybe you do not, or so, but I can't, I can't help. But rather that they too quickly abolish the unthought in thinking, in reason as well as in Geist, as it shows itself at the boundary. Because the boundary is constitutively not just a concept, it also indicates a limit to its own conceptualization, its resistance to thinking and to being thought, and thus reveals its inner contradiction or aporia. And yet both conceptions of a philosophy of a border, precisely in their systemic failure to succeed, represent the prerequisite for thinking the border as a border of thought. However, here is also a need to go one step further. On the one hand, to be able to position this unthought in thought as a separate category in relation to reason and spirit. And what could be better suited for that than the category of the unconscious? And on the other hand, to make the border comprehensible as a special object of desire or anxiety, as we experience this today in this, total political craze about borders. And finally, to show how the boundary as an object of desire, anxiety is anchored within the symbolic order of modernity. Psychoanalysis is undoubtedly indispensable here for all three aspects in order to address this multi-layered problem of thinking about the border and to be able to assess its political consequences. So the nomadologists among us, if there are any here, nomadologists, would surely object that psychoanalysis is the problem and not the solution. It always appears as the guardian of the holy grail of boundaries and symbolic laws. And therefore liberation or emancipation can only be conceived by overcoming them. this objection is not entirely unjustified, because as we all know, psychoanalysis does indeed always speak in the name of boundaries and laws. What is decisive, however, is that we are dealing here with two fundamentally different anthropologies. For example, if Rousseau says that man is born free and everywhere he lays in chains, and this is undoubtedly the basic mythology of nomadology, and therefore the first fence that was erected marks the beginning of bourgeois society, which must be overcome, then psychoanalysis tells a completely different story. Psychoanalysis says that man is born in complete dependence. Yeah? There's no freedom. Yeah? In the baby, it's complete dependence. And to become even rudimentarily free requires a hard piece of work, especially towards those people who have made life and survival possible for him or her in the first place, meaning his, her parents, caregivers, the clan, or society. Therefore, there's a fundamental lack of freedom or autonomy, and this lack cannot be remedied by returning behind the lack to a quasi-natural mode of being, the homme naturel in Rousseau. In order to be able to say of oneself that one is free, limits must first and foremost be set and asserted in the face of symbolic and also empirical normative laws. This certainly results in the necessity of a social contract, but that is maybe where nomadology and psychoanalysis might perhaps meet again. However, the various schools of psychoanalysis differ considerably in how the individual components of its anthropology are conceived and related to each other. And yet, with a few exceptions, there's Otto Gross, Wilhelm Reich, some self-psychologists, there's a common frame of reference that contradicts the basic nomadologist assumption of a natural and therein free man, woman. Some apply the laws very strictly in the sense of universal conditions, others base their anthropology more on Hobbes than on Rousseau, emphasizing natural aggressiveness and thus the death drive, and which calls for a social contract in the sense of a strong state. However, neither of these versions seems, absolutely compelling to me, and they remain controversial within the various schools. However, the exchange between desire, drive, or any other motivational horizon and the law is always at the center. Nevertheless, the boundary does not simply lie in between the drive and the law. Rather, the drive itself presents already a boundary between soma and psyche, and the law is the sedimented boundary per se. In other words, the object at which the drive aims and whose enjoyment the law can permit or prohibit does not simply indicate a limit. Rather, and this will be my central claim here, this limit or boundary is itself the actual object of psychoanalysis. In other words, as an exemplary psychoanalytic object, the boundary is not, as we've heard today already, an epistemic object that stands opposite a subject, but an object that only exists in a certain form of relatedness. For example, as a drive object in Freud, as a part or partial object in Klein, as a transitional object in Winnicott, as a beta element in Bion, as an object of desire, the lack object, or finally the objet petit a in Lacan. The boundary is the object of an object relationship, I say this carefully, or better, object relatedness, because it is again highly controversial whether this relatedness is a relationship at all. As long as the object is located monodirectionally as the object of a drive, as in early Freud, or as at the intersection of two drives, as in late Freud and in Klein, Eros and Thanatos, but also between pure, emotional qualities such as pleasure or anxiety, were particularly significant for the boundary. There can be no question of an object relationship. So and Lacan is also saying, the relationship to what Freud says about the object is not an object relationship. Only in the shift that the post-Kleinians make, following on from Klein's focus on the mother-child relationship, that means the pre-Oedipal stages of development, to the effect that it is not simply two drives that meet, but two or more subjects with their respective drive endowments, which exchange themselves by means of the mechanisms of projection and introjection, can we actually speak of relationships. This is the beginning of object relations theories. Lacan will respond to them, as we've heard from Amanda before in Seminar 4, with the intrusion of the symbolic into the object relation of mother and child. That means with a new version of a Oedipal triangulation within the framework of a new third, as I would call it, topology of psychoanalysis between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The phallus here becomes the main object, as Lacan calls it, now represents the symbolic law that tears open every object relation and anchors in it, as we've heard before, the whole of the real, the object as object-like. This means that every object relation is already symbolically interrupted in the various registers of frustration, and privatization, and it is therefore questionable whether it exists as such at all. Eric Laurent has sharpened this theoretical conflict as follows. Quote, each time a Kleinian said, I must set limits, the Lacanian said, I must respect the law. That is, relevant for the 1950s, 60s, that's what he's referring to. In other words, relationships, in the Kleinian sense, are mediated by boundaries, while the symbolic and the real are determined by the law. Indeed, in the context of object relationship theories, the question of how to deal with boundaries has become crucial, especially in the practical, psychoanalytic work. For example, how rigid or how flexible a boundary can be, how it can be set towards others, but also how it can be demanded from oneself, how frustration and guilt can be endured, and thus how the depressive position can be strengthened, which makes it possible to recognize the other as an other in the first place, and thus puts the paranoid position, schizoid position of pure desire back in its place. There can therefore be neither total openness in the sense of nomadology nor rigid closure in the sense of a universal law. The negotiability of boundaries characterizes the actual psychoanalytic commitment here. However, on the contrary, in the various Lacanian fields, the law continues to be a central point of orientation, even if it has perhaps receded somehow into the background compared to the concept of a will. I mean, you all know that much better than I do. Or that there's a shift, I just recommend, from the phallic law, more in the direction of a Marxian law of value, around the fifth discussion of the fifth discourse. This at least makes clear that even the law is not simply a universal law or pattern, as was thought in the 1920s. It can at least change its character from phallus as a law which interrupts and prohibits infantile physical enjoyment to the concept of jouissance, which is a command to enjoyment and things like that. So I would be very curious how the law works in this different layers. So are there only relationships, as the object relations theorists say, for them everything is a relationship? Or does the relationship not exist at all, as the Lacanians say, precisely because the relationship is always already interrupted by the law? Am I getting too long? And are therefore all attempts to think the boundary in the sense of an object relationship, are they just smoke and mirrors, in a certain way? There's indeed a tendency within the framework of object relations to misunderstand the relatedness of the object in the sense of enabling good relationships, even of a life in relationships. Amanda was also referring to that kind of, that was already part of what Lacan criticized upon that. Or in the sense of transforming split paranoid schizoid structures into communicative depressive ones. So that was always a way of making bad relationship better. But there are undoubtedly limits to this. Klein already warned that the depressive position cannot really be achieved. The communicative structural formations themselves necessarily create new splits. And on the other hand, in terms of the Lacanians, is there not also a tendency towards what Eric Laurent again calls the sacralization of the symbolic and the law? Nice formula. And what is a law in that sense, anyhow? What made it law? What distinguished it from a mere boundary, and what entity and instance is realized in it? Is it the structure of a mind, an anthropological or phylogenetical form of existence, or even a historical and social constellation as patriarchy or capital? Is the unconscious a suitable common denominator for all these determinations? For Klein, the boundary is what must be wrested free from the unconscious fantasy, which knows no boundary, only unconditional love and abysmal hatred. In a similar way to Freud's position of the 1920s, that means the ego psychologist Freud, we should not forget that he is the inventor of ego psychology. For him, the it is supposed to become the ego. The boundary exists towards the unconscious, even if this is argued differently in every case. So the ego and it is not simultaneous with conscious and unconscious. So there are unconscious aspects in the it, the Abwehr mechanism, defense mechanisms, and things like that. But, don't have to go into the detail here. But in the Lacan of the 1950s, the concept of the law can be read as a boundary in the unconscious itself. So it's not towards the unconscious. A boundary that is defined by the difference between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And therefore, boundary and law are therefore boundary and law really the alternatives of thinking the boundary itself as an object, as either the boundary is an object of a relationship that first brings into being the delimiting, by delimiting it from the unconscious fantasy, or the boundary as the object of a lack that makes precisely every relationship impossible. I think that neither the Kleinian limit can be drawn in a strict sense, nor can the law really be implemented as a pure object of the unconscious. For who could even formulate such a law? So if we, and that is my proposition, if we reject the strict alternative, I know that, the differences are important, but, I would propose to reject the strict alternative of the boundary and the law here, then it would at least not be a question of the existence of relationships and boundaries, of their non-existence. For every assertion of a non-existence of something, like, we had that before, sexual relationship, the woman, the meta-language, presupposes at least the rudimentary recognition of its existence. Otherwise, it could not be denied. Only because there are women does the sentence, the woman doesn't exist, make sense. Just as the sentence, there is no meta-language, is clearly itself a meta-linguistic utterance, at least to a certain degree. But that is not, that with sentences are wrong. It is that Lacan seems to me to be concerned precisely towards such pointed paradoxes, and that's what makes it great. That's why we try to decipher them. But not in a. It would be very interesting to distinguish what the literal meaning of a sentence and this paradoxical meaning could mean if we put it in relationship in each individual case. So instead of existence or non-existence, I would therefore suggest starting from a certain relatedness of relationship and non-relationship, whereby non-relationship is not understood as part of a relationship, as the split relationship in the Kleinian sense, whereby non-relationship is not, as a split relationship, for example, which could be transformed towards a more communicative relationship, the non-relationship is of a different nature than the relationship. It is which does not allow for a relationship and cannot be inferred as a relationship. It therefore indicates a different kind of boundary, a final boundary, perhaps, which allows us to better understand the categories of law and boundary themselves. Such relatedness between relation and non-relation indicates a relation that cannot be a relationship and still points towards it. I was writing this in German, so in German we have this word Verhältnis, yeah, which is, we can say, there's a Verhältnis between a relationship and non-relationship, or what Jelitsa was mentioning before, the term nexus, between contingency and necessity. So those terms I would be very interested what they could mean. And for the German word Verhältnis is funny. It just, it's a nexus, proportionality in a certain way, but it also has a sexual connotation. It's not a Verhältnis is not a long-term relationship, but an affair. Yeah. So in that sense, relationship and non-relationship are having an affair with each other, so to say. And I think this affair, this Verhältnis of relationship and non-relationship presupposes both a logical and a historical space. The psychoanalytic object of a boundary, let's just call it here now, objet petit, now seems to be to concern precisely this Verhältnis of relationship and non-relationship. It neither mediates this relationship nor can it be resolved in one direction. However, it condenses this Verhältnis, this relation, in logical space towards a common point, the intersection of two coordinates of a matrix, whereby the horizontal coordinate of the opposition can be mediated via the boundary within the framework of, relationships, good or bad, split or communicative, whatever, whereas the vertical axis indicates the interruption of this kind of play within relationships. In the name of the law, the whole of the real, and on the scale of existence and non-existence, because there always has to be a relation between existence and non-existence, otherwise we wouldn't be able to talk about it. Within this matrix, then, there are both relations and non-relations. They can neither be synthesized with each other in the sense of merely different forms of relation, nor can they be completely dissolved into non-relations. If you have non-relations, I wouldn't know what that would be. They remain dependent on each other without being able to specify a common goal. The boundary as an object shows us here in its constitutive double relatedness that it can only ever be addressed from a certain point of view within the fields defined by those coordinates. So we don't have an overview, we can't rationalize or formalize completely, that matrix, because we're always positioned within it. And that is why we can only imagine this matrix in logical space, not in social or better bio-psychosocial space, where it necessarily remains an object of desire and anxiety. Consequently, this matrix represents the precondition of our misery, the political misery, namely that we can only ever judge the border from a certain position, and thus always already included in its symbolic regime. Even if we say that the border does not exist, it does exist, at least at the object of our efforts to abolish it. It exists, but its existence remains withdrawn from us because it is always already presupposed. Presumably, this is only that makes it more and more powerful. This is where the historical dimension comes into place. The relevance of this logical matrix can only be deduced from a specific historical formation. It is by no means universal because it has no meaning in pre-modern or non-modern societies. There, in these, in non-modern life, boundaries represent stable ordering factors such as the sacred and the profane, the divine and the human, the raw and the cooked, childhood and maturity. The boundaries must remain permeable for only specific individuals such as shamans or heroes in order to maintain order within these boundaries. Even the liminal experiences of rites of passage ultimately confirm the orders and do not abolish them. That's the difference to modern, avant-garde transgression ideals. Not so in modernity. There's no symbolic closure here. The boundaries are anything but stable. They are constantly shifting and must therefore always be renegotiated. Everything ultimately revolves around boundaries precisely because there is no order that clearly regulates their use. And that is why the symbolic law of modernity consists precisely in not having a law. And as we know, totality is not all, as the exemplary object of the symbolic order of modernity. The boundary represents the absence of the law, and this absence of the law makes it so productive as, the hyper-productivity of borders we are confronted with. And the transcendental is actually the name for these constantly shifting boundaries, so I've tried to work out with Kant, and the constitutively postponed foundation of a new symbolic order that would actually be law and order. The unconscious is the driving force in this. It prevents any closure and drives us to act out the split. The unconscious and the transcendental correlate here as constantly internalized and dynamized boundaries, as a common final frontier, so to speak. The unconscious exists in the strict sense only under these conditions. In the pre-modern world, there is simply no unconscious. Mythology doesn't need an unconscious, or whatever religion. Can this logical historical constellation be challenged? I hope so, but probably only within the framework of a transcendental, that means constitutively future critique of the pure unconscious. So to come to an end, only several more lines, can nothing be done politically from here? The crucial question. On the contrary, politics must be done, and the existing boundaries and laws have to be, contested in many different ways. Otherwise, we simply wouldn't have politics. Politics, however, is its own, produces its own limits and laws. Politics is not a pure means that points the way to a space of pure abundance or redemption, as the nomadologists promise, but an end or purpose in itself that has always been ascribed in the transcendental unconscious of symbolic modernity. In other words, politics does not exist as a solution to the associated problems, but only as a risk of exposing oneself to this dimension. In purely empirical terms, I can neither be aware of the effects that my political practice triggers, nor of my true interests, desires, and anxieties. I think that is what logically I have no control over that of psychoanalysis. Consequently, as long as politics is conceived as a mere means to a good end, it does not have its own preconditions in the transcendental unconscious at its disposal. It can, however, face up to these conditions, or at least reckon with them. Accordingly, any kind of emancipatory politics must be oriented towards the transcendental dimension of its stakes, because equality and freedom, autonomy and authenticity, originality and totality cannot be grasped empirically. They have very little, empirically substance. The central political question of a possible social contract is probably also affected by this. As Rousseau already knew, the social contract as an actualization of a common will, the volonté générale, can only be expressed as a paradox, which at least makes the transcendental unconscious dimension of a problem visible. In other words, a social contract is needed that can be neither a concrete empirical contract about different sorts of social relationships, nor a universal and purely transcendent law either, especially not a moral law in the Kantian sense. Rather, such a social contract which is constitutively bound within certain empirical limits demands an unconditional or radical orientation of all particular social relations towards a constitutively transcendental universalism that means the non-relation per se, from which equality, freedom, autonomy, and dignity can only be conceived. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have some time for questions. Anybody? Any questions? Okay, if not, then I'll have the chance to start. I have two. One. Actually, I have two questions for the beginning. The first one is related to the end of your text, when you refer to the question of politics, and you mentioned that, let's say, the affect, one might say, of politics is such that you don't have control. No. And this could be understood in the sense that you don't have control in the sense of there are no boundaries, no limits to the effect of politics in this sense. And I wondered whether this, whether you would say that then politics has precisely a moment of not, ein Nichtverhältnis, of not being connected, not being related, or finding an exit from any relationship, precisely in this moment of losing control. And how you would relate this.
Maybe it's the moment of losing control, which could be a political moment again. I mean, that would be the interesting aspect. And obviously, I'm not referring to the single, positions we were discussing here, but more to this general, mainstream. Especially in the art world, everyone is an activist, and at universities we all know what this to. We even had in a presentation for a media studies job, someone said, everything is known, we just have to do it, This was just completely generalized, activist imaginary, which I think is important to question in a certain way. But obviously the question is how we can do it without, just letting politics loose, so to say. And I think in this, I would say there must be different strategies, more experimental, as we have heard today already, ways of addressing the problem in a certain way. That politics is not the solution. That it is, it's also part of the problem. The right is also political. So it can't be, nowadays, they would have rejected that in earlier times maybe, but nowadays we are obviously also political. Or since a long time already. Is this an answer, or you're not happy? But
I'm not that sure, but I don't want to. Okay, so I can continue, but let me try to put to grasp it from another angle. I mean, your position on the question of the universal. I was wondering. So you have been criticizing the let's say the question of universalism as such, or universalism as such, and I was wondering whether you take the question of universalism as a question of the law, and if this is the let's say only frame within which you would accept the position that is of universalism.
Yeah, that is a real challenging question. On the one hand, on how this relationship of law and universalism really looks like, how is it sought? I think that would be very interesting with the Lacanians, but you and to discuss. And on the other hand, if one, when I'm calling it transcendental universalism, which I can, it's for me the only possible, reference system in a certain way, that implies, that this is, that is transcendental is not a universalism in a strict sense. That is the problem. So that can be easily criticized, but that is implied. So I would. Antonia is discussing with her, courage without heroism, goes exactly in this direction. What kind of risk is that, And does it in the constellation, does it nowadays again need heroism to, you know, to do that? Yeah, the party we had today already, is it heroism? Is it something, you know, truly implementing a new law or so? Or is it, and because that is for me, you know, that's not my experience in life, yeah. So that is mine, is that, you know, that we need that kind of orientation, but it's obviously clear that it's an impossible position, yeah. So that it can't. So I'm not very clear here, but just to distinguish that there is a theoretical question, you know, how is this relationship between law and universalism? I think this is the theory. And the other one, the political question, how we can, you know, relate either to law or to universalism in a certain way, if they are not identical, yeah? And they probably are not, yeah? Maybe there's a difference, yeah? But Alexei, you had a question, yeah?
Alexei, please, do you have a microphone? Thank you.
Two questions. I mean, they're both maybe about I guess a decision that you make to emphasize the problematic of the boundary over that of limit. You know, and I guess I was struck by one of the sort of moves you were making in the paper, which was, I mean, I think a really interesting one, which is you almost recoding, let's say, the nomadologists as a kind of as neo-Rousseauians, and then, you know, and likewise in the sort of the Hobbesian moment. What was struck me is that, to some extent, the conception of modernity that you have would be that sort of is implicit, is that we're trapped within this liberal framework ultimately. You know, so that there's a kind of dialectic that gets repeated between the Rousseauian and the Hobbesian. But then what I'm kind of curious about is how then the sort of this, let's say the moment of Marx or something is left out, which would be, you know, the question of, which would, you know, on the theoretical level, raise the question of how you want to think the relationship between non-relation and relation, this problem of verhältnis and its relation to law, because the question is that sort of always creeps back in would be that there's a kind of effort to have a transcendental framework in which we can decide from above in relationship to the demarcation of boundaries, such that we are always trapped in this idea of reinstituting the problem of law and order, right? So that we're kind of trapped within a kind of modernization of the problematic of the loss of the mythical cosmos. And we're not then in this moment of, let's say, radical politics, in which we'd have to think precisely that there's an impasse between, let's say, different epochs or different transcendentals. That there can't be a transcendental of the transcendental. That would be a fantasy. That would be the fantasy of the generalization or universalization of the liberal order, which is kind of, let's say, maybe the fantasy of liberalism, that this is the end of history. So I guess my question is if you emphasize the problematic of the limit and then rethink the problematic of the limit as a starting point, then one has to think out of the problem of like a kind of interruption of the cosmos or non-totalizability. And that there is, and that's where I see then how I would maybe interpret a little bit the question of the non-sexual relation or the non-relation in the later Lacan moving in a different direction, which would be too much to kind of go into that. But I mean, maybe you see the question, maybe it's almost more of a comment than a question.
I mean, it's, you know, I'm just, you know, wrote this in the last 2 weeks or so. I don't have answers to every, you know, aspect. And I think even, you know, just with translation aspects, with, you know, with limitation and delimitation, also that this doesn't work in English as I had written it in German with B und Entgrenzung, and others, come up. And so the term limit is already very interesting here, and the different English, terms of border, boundary, and limit, and the different activities is already very difficult to grasp in a certain way. But the limit is a limit in a certain way, whereas a boundary is enabling something, and I think that I have more of this kind of positive, charge on it in a certain way. Yeah, it's also the conference paper says border also, which is clearly, we have political borders, but how do borders and boundaries and all that go together, I think. And from that background, I try to resituate that, with focusing on what kind of object is the boundary, in its ambivalence of, enabling things and, restricting things and making them possible in this context of what, what the main, for me, my perspective is main psychoanalytic conflict between the relation or the boundary, the limit, and the law is the relation and the non-relation. And I think that in political terms, this is, I would also agree, to a certain degree that this cannot be, and I try to defend myself against, that this is just a meta-discourse for liberalism or something like that. But indeed, I'm, having problems in understanding, militant subjectivity in that sense of being completely outside of that, a completely other form of subjectivity. And we have had this discussion, how subjectivities and becoming subjects and what does it mean, a possessive all people, like, with Katja, our friend, or so, focusing so much on Macpherson's, possessive individualism or things like that as the crucial subject position. But, I'm also happy if I own my phone and things like that. And, I have difficulties to imagine what kind of subjectivity, could be possibly, beyond that, looking onto the matrix and defining the law in a certain way, I wouldn't like to be in that position myself, I wouldn't like to define the law in a certain way, but I think but that there is a law, and that's what we were discussing in the morning already, that the law has obviously, it's the old Hegelian argument that the law is making us free, it's not a constraint, but that the law itself has this enabling dimension, I think is really very important. And so, as you see, I'm getting, stumbling here. It's not that I have a solution to that, but I think it's important to question especially within the political discourse, the preconditions, the pre-assumptions, especially nomadology, because nomadology has become really, that's what people say, open the borders and everything will be fine, in a certain way. And it's such a difficult question, such a challenge, that we don't know how to deal with it. And we have to avoid that political stillstand. We have to confront ourselves with that question, because everything, the borders are part of our privilege, that we can discuss here philosophy in a certain way, and all our institutional realities are part of that, And so there is a, I have no, on the empirical level, I don't want to discuss that, and I don't want to go into that, but to acknowledge that there is a problem, and that this problem cannot be solved in a way that we are just not talking about it anymore. That is what left-wing liberalism is doing. In Germany, I mean, it's terrible, to see that. There's no, that it's an end of political discourse in a certain way, And I think this is absolutely not acceptable, And so I think it's the way how to deal with that. And that is why I found, the paper when Jelica sent it so provoking in a certain way. What are these layers, What are the borders, here, how can we negotiate that, Yeah.
Helmut. So I just have a very, not simple question, but my question is if you could clarify maybe a little bit more the notion of the transcendental you were using. In the beginning, it was the transcendental perpetuum mobile, and then it was the transcendental unconscious, and in the end, the transcendental universalism. So I was wondering if this is the same notion of the transcendental throughout, or is there a transformation of the transcendental within your paper itself?
Obviously, a very good question, but we did this conference on the transcendental in Vienna, and where my argument was essentially, the transcendental, in the Kantian sense, as setting the limits of knowledge or whatever doesn't work in a certain way, but the transcendental is in itself a highly interesting speculative term. Yeah, it's actually speculative. It's in itself not transcendental in a strict sense, but it enables something, as a speculative term to understand, maybe a third object or whatever. Which allows us to understand, and in its ambivalence with kind of, what I call the more knowledge, with kind of, what is the real challenge today. Not that we have knowledge and truth, but that we have this enormously, growing knowledge, and and that this is part of that, and the transcendental would be both a symptom of that, of that. Precisely how Kant was using it, as a, trying to define a limit, but this limit made the knowledge explode, so it's a symptom, but at the same time, it's a highly interesting speculative category, which makes us precisely understand that, what is going on, or leads the way, and in a, for me, very more interesting way than affirmative infinity in Hegel, which but there it's obviously the internalization of a border, the positiveness of an inner boundary, which is so interesting. So I think it's necessary to synthesize without synthesis, to syncretize. That's what I'm doing. Now syncretizing, not synthesizing. Different elements and trying to give them a different, take.
Okay, thank you, and I think we're going to close the discussion. Thank you, Helmut, once again for your talk and for the discussion, and we are